Throughout the history of the NFL, over 500 players have started a game at quarterback. However, among the many, one stands out as being the best. Whether you love him or you hate him, at this point, you have to accept that Tom Brady is the greatest of all time. Now that he's been retired for 2 years, it got me thinking, who in today's NFL comes closest to the GOAT? To answer this question, I used data science to look at what players today have the most similar play styles. Nobody in the modern NFL can truly compare to Brady when it comes to Super Bowl rings, career longevity, or all-time records. But if we zoom in on the way he actually played from game to game, we might be able to find some quarterbacks that are fairly similar. To start, we need to decide on who the potential candidates for closest to Brady are. In order to be properly compared, the players need to play quarterback and also have enough data to work with. Last season, 34 quarterbacks had at least 250 passing attempts, which gives us our list of candidates. For each of these quarterbacks, I gathered 10 statistics that encompass different aspects of quarterback play, and I also recorded these 10 statistics for Tom Brady's career. These statistics will allow us to concretely see whose play last season was most similar to Tom Brady. While much of Tom Brady's greatness comes from what he did in the playoffs, the data I used is just for the regular season. Since many quarterbacks don't make the playoffs, it was best to exclude playoff data to keep the comparisons consistent. Also, the data used is just from the 2024 season. This analysis could be done using players' career averages, but players change over time, and I wanted to see who in their current form is playing the closest to Tom Brady. So for that, I just used last season's data. So we have the data and the players, but how do we actually go about finding the closest player to Tom Brady? If we were just looking at one statistic, finding the closest player would be easy. For example, if we were looking at touchdown percentage, for any given player, we can subtract the value of their touchdown percentage from Tom Brady's percentage and then take the absolute value since the distance should always be positive. Then, whoever has the smallest distance is the closest to Tom Brady. Another equivalent way of ensuring the distance is positive is to first square the quantity and then take the square root. This might seem like an unnecessary complication, but we'll soon see why I wrote it this way. If you add in another statistic, say interception percentage, we can think of each player as a point in 2D space. You might remember from math class the distance formula for 2 points, which stems from the Pythagorean theorem. Using this formula, we can calculate the 2D distance between Tom Brady and each player. Now, what happens when we get a third variable in? Well, the distance formula actually generalizes to higher dimensions, and distances can be calculated very similarly, just with an extra variable. Using this, we could calculate the distances between each player and Tom Brady in 3D space to find the closest. So what do we do when all 10 statistics are being used? Well, one way to think about it is as Tom Brady and all the other players being points in 10-dimensional space, which sounds way more complicated than it actually is. While it can't be visualized due to us living in a 3D world, all it really is using the same methods we would use with 2 or 3 dimensions and doing it with vectors that contain 10 values. Using the generalized distance formula, we can calculate the distances in 10D space between Tom Brady and all the other players and then see who is the closest. Before we get into the data, there is one more thing we have to do to ensure the distances are calculated fairly. If we just calculated the distances with all 10 statistics in their original form, some variables would have much more of a say than others due to their magnitudes being different. To find the closest player, we want all 10 statistics to be treated equally, and the way we can do this is to ensure that each variable has the same mean and standard deviation. This can be done mathematically by taking each data point, subtracting the mean, and dividing by the standard deviation. This makes every variable have approximately mean 0 and standard deviation 1, which ensures that all of the statistics will have equal weight. So now we have the data, we have the methodology, and we have all we need to see who the closest player is to Tom Brady. But before we get to the big reveal, let's first explore the individual statistics to better see what's being measured and who some contenders are. The first statistic we'll look at is passing attempts per game. Everyone knows Tom Brady liked to throw the ball, and throughout his career he averaged around 36 passes per game. In 2024, this would have been the 4th highest, with just Tua, Joe Burrow, and Patrick Mahomes being ahead of him, with Dak Prescott being the closest overall. In addition to looking at the number of attempts, in quantifying players, we also want to see what they are doing on these passing attempts. So the next 5 statistics are dedicated to further describing these quarterbacks' passing ability. The first of these we'll look at is yards per attempt. Tom Brady's career yards per attempt was a fairly modest 7.4 yards, which puts him in the upper half of 2024 quarterbacks, but over a yard short of Lamar Jackson, who had the highest yards per attempt at 8.8. Both Jaden Daniels and Russell Wilson were perfect matches to Tom Brady, with their yards per attempt also being 7.4. Next up, we want to quantify how often a player's passes are being caught, and we can do this with completion percentage. I was surprised to see that Tom Brady's career completion percentage was only around 64%, which puts him in the bottom half of quarterbacks last season, with Russell Wilson and Dak Prescott as the closest players. On each drive, quarterbacks have the goal of getting the ball into the end zone and scoring points. The next statistic of touchdown pass percentage measures just this with how frequently they threw touchdowns. This stat puts Tom Brady back closer to the top. His touchdown percentage of 5.4% would have been the 8th best last season, tied with Derek Carr and near Jaden Daniels and Josh Allen. Arguably more important than throwing touchdowns is not turning the ball over. Our next statistic of interception percentage measures this by looking at what percentage of passing attempts result in interceptions. Tom Brady's career interception percentage of 1.8 puts him solidly in the upper half of quarterbacks last year, with Tua and Derek Carr having a very similar percentage. Another negative outcome quarterbacks desperately want to avoid is a sack. The next statistic of sack percentage looks at what percentage of dropbacks resulted in a sack. Some might argue that this depends more on the offensive line than the quarterback, but research has shown that sack rates change much more when the same team changes quarterback versus when a quarterback changes teams. This indicates that whether it's through setting the protection, getting the ball out quickly, or scrambling out of the pocket, certain quarterbacks are just better at not getting sacked. While Tom Brady was certainly not known for his elusiveness, he was very good at not getting sacked. His career sack percentage of 4.5% puts him in the top 6 of quarterbacks last season, just above Lamar Jackson. Speaking of Lamar Jackson, nowadays passing is just one of the ways quarterbacks can be productive. In addition to looking at how quarterbacks pass the ball, we also want to measure how much they run. We'll start out with rushing attempts per game. To nobody's surprise, Tom Brady has a very low rushing attempts per game at around 2. This puts him near the bottom of quarterbacks last season, around Jared Goff and Jameis Winston. Next, in addition to how often quarterbacks run, we also want to measure how productive these runs are, and we can do this with yards per rush attempt. Again, Tom Brady is near the bottom, with his 1.6 rushing yards per attempt being the 4th lowest of all players last season. The closest players to Tom Brady for this stat were Jared Goff and Matthew Stafford. To round off the rushing section, we also want to measure how often the quarterback's rushes resulted in touchdowns, and we can do this by looking at the percentage of their rushes that were touchdowns. Tom Brady's percentage of 4 is actually fairly high and would have been the 15th highest last season. And if we think about it, it actually makes sense that this is relatively high, since so many of his rushes were quarterback sneaks. The closest players for this stat are Jameis Winston, Jordan Love, and Jaden Daniels. Finally, for the last statistic, I wanted to measure the clutch factor which Tom Brady is known for. While there is no one statistic measuring clutchness, one thing we can look at is game-winning drives. Over his career, around 17% of Tom Brady's games had him leading a game-winning drive. This would have put him fairly middle of the road last season around Aaron Rodgers, Bo Nix, and Kyler Murray. This value likely isn't higher for Tom Brady, since in many of his games, he was already winning and didn't need to lead a game-winning drive. A better statistic would probably be the percentage of game-winning drive opportunities converted, but it turns out it's very hard to quantify what a game-winning drive opportunity is, so this isn't a stat that's readily available. Nevertheless, the percentage of games with a game-winning drive adds some information and is the last of the 10 statistics used to compare Tom Brady to the other quarterbacks. So now we have seen all of the individual stats, but overall, who is the closest to Brady? After crunching the numbers, I have the distances from each player to Tom Brady. The third closest player with a distance of 2.66 is Aaron Rodgers. The second closest, with a distance of 2.41, is Tua Tagovailoa. And finally, the closest player to Tom Brady with a distance of 2.40 is Matthew Stafford. Using the distances, we can also see who the furthest players are, and it turns out that Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Anthony Richardson are the furthest away. Intuitively, this seems like a pretty good fit. Matthew Stafford is a veteran quarterback who is a frequent and successful passer and also not a very frequent runner. He still has a ways to go to catch up to Tom Brady in the ring department, but at least playing style wise, he is the closest current player. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. And also shout out to Jimmy Highroller for the inspiration for this video. If you haven't seen it before, feel free to check out his video on finding the closest player to LeBron. That's all from me. Until next time, peace.